See, let me flip this, right? Like every company in India and across the world needs to become sustainable.
Correct.
Right? The only way we or anyone can achieve that if it's product, right? If you try to do this through consulting, there's no way SMEs can become
250,
sustainable,
yeah.
right? Like there's only such a limited set of companies, right? So the way I think about it, there is no option. We have to figure it out, right? We might have gone just 20% of the way there, but we know we have to solve the rest because, I mean, what's the alternative? Right?
I would imagine that you're operating in a very data poor landscape.
Correct.
And really, you're dealing with scraps of data, and pretty much everything can be a rabbit hole of things, right? I mean, looking at all of the decision making that goes across the business life cycle.
Absolutely.
So, could you take us through, like, a typical customer? What is your starting point, and how do you achieve success with them?
Sure. I mean, I'll let Ankit kind of talk about some of the business side logistics, but maybe I can answer your question about, data and things like that. I think the approach we generally take is first trying to understand kind of where the client is at, what data they have access to, what they're hoping to achieve, how we can kind of help them understand where they are in their ESG journey and where they need to go, and work with them to co-develop kind of that process, right? So that tends to, at least now, be somewhat consultative. And it is intentionally consultative. So it provides us with very clear feedback on the kinds of products we need to build. And I can get into that in a bit. But as part of that process is kind of this gap analysis from a data perspective as well, right? Understanding where they have data, where they don't have data, what kind of data, how it is structured, how easy it is to access, if there are kind of, security or privacy implications of accessing that kind of data. There are all these different considerations that go into that process. And then finally, you kind of get a set of relatively structured data that is ready to kind of be input into a system. We've been working over the last year to make sure that our system is flexible enough to accept a lot of different types of that kind of end data, and we've built it specifically with kind of large Indian companies in mind. Like Ankit was saying, talking to clients, understanding the kinds of data stored that they may have, and then working backward from that to understand what we need to kind of provide them. But once we do that, there's still a lot of work that needs to happen between kind of taking, let's say, for example, financial statement and converting that to a carbon accounting statement, right? There's just a lot of steps in between, right? And so that's why, I mean, this is a very interesting challenge for me personally as well, because there's a lot of technical work that needs to happen there, right? Like there's a lot of modeling work that needs to go into kind of trying to provide kind of a best guess for a lot of things where you don't have data, and then using hardcore data when you do have it, right? And when I say best guess, I mean kind of developing, state of the science models, as Ankit was mentioning, to provide kind of state of the science accuracy, which doesn't always mean it is 100% accurate, right? Because as you were mentioning, the space is rapidly evolving, and where we are today is definitely not 100% kind of accurate, and we will never, there's this famous saying, right? Like, no models are accurate, but some are useful. And so we kind of try and actively take that lens of understanding, as Ankit was saying, what is the decision-making kind of criteria, right? Like where can we actually allow our clients to make empowered decisions that will move them in the right direction while offering them state-of-the-science accuracy where possible. And so I'm happy to dive into the data science side of things here. I mean, I guess at a high level, and as I was saying, there's data in one format, let's call it financial data. That's one type of data, right? You could imagine another type of data being operational data that talks about, how many liters of diesel you consumed. So that is one type of data. There's one layer abstracted away from that, which is how much you spent on diesel, right? And there's one layer deeper that says, what are the emissions associated with 1 liter of diesel, right? So you can think of these, I'm just simplifying it, but you can think of these 3 different layers. So you can imagine working with a company and asking them directly, hey, do you know how many liters of diesel you've consumed in this quarter, right? Let's say they say, yes, we know these are the specific activities that we use diesel for, and this is the exact amount of diesel that we use, right? Then it becomes a somewhat easier exercise to say, okay, well, I know that when 1 liter of diesel is combusted, this is these many kilograms of CO2 are emitted, right? So it becomes a relatively simple calculation. I say relatively simple, but there are a lot of caveats there as well. But in the interest of time, I won't dive into kind of the specifics there. But there is a model basically that kind of takes this information and provides kind of a very informed estimate for kind of the amount of carbon associated with that activity. There's another layer, as I was saying, where they don't have information on how much diesel they use. They just know how much they spent on diesel. So there's another model that says, okay, well, based on when it was consumed, based on when it was purchased, based on where it was purchased, this is likely the amount of diesel, right? And so you can imagine then kind of a layer going from spend-based data to quantity-based data, and then quantity-based data to kind of emission data. And that emission data is then aggregated across the entire country, across the entire company, across all these different activities, and you get an estimate for their emissions, right? So that, but I choose diesel because it's a very simple one. You could imagine if instead of diesel, the question was, well, I buy a lot of pens and pencils, and that contributes to what's called scope 3 emissions. What are the emissions associated with that pen and pencil? You can imagine that's a lot more complicated than like diesel, right? And so I'm simplifying it just to illustrate kind of the different levels, but it is a very complex kind of technical problem, but that's also what makes this like fun and interesting. Like it's a very interesting problem to solve.
And what we've also tried to do is really understand what type of data customers have today. Right. So one thing we realized that in India specifically, accounting data tends to be very similar across organizations because GST is standardized. Right. Now we started using accounting data for a lot of our calculations because it may not be the deepest data, but it's consistent. It's always auditable. Companies rely on it. It's much easier to get it.
It's a source of truth.
It becomes a source of truth, right? So. And we get to a certain level of accuracy with that, but it helps customers move forward, right? That becomes a starting point. And then you say, okay, out of this entire bucket of emissions, where are the biggest hotspots? And let's go deeper there rather than trying to achieve 100% accuracy on everything. The other thing we also do is we do this at layers, right? So for example, when we work with banks, we tell them, hey, we can start with, you just give us category level data of how you do lending. Or you can go one level deeper and give us very accurate subsector level data. Or you can go one level further deeper and give us loan level data. Or we can go further deeper and actually engage with the companies you lend to get that data, right? So we allow customers to also choose at what level of abstraction do they want to start and what depending on what data they have, what buy-in they have into. You have to manage both the types of data and that level of abstraction in each of those categories of data.
Right. So it seems rather complex, and how do you think about scaling something like this? Because if you think of a productized approach to this, right? I mean, I wouldn't even know where to start, right? Other than perhaps building some tools that could make your life a little simpler in terms of data crunching and whatnot. How do you build a customer-facing tool for something like this? Like, where do you start?
See, let me flip this, right? Like every company in India and across the world needs to become sustainable.
Correct.
Right? The only way we or anyone can achieve that if it's productized, right? If you try to do this through consulting, there's no way SMEs can become sustainable, right? Like there's only such a limited set of companies, right? So the way I think about it, there is no option. We have to figure it out, right? We might have gone just 20% of the way there, but we know we have to solve the rest because, I mean, what's the alternative, right? That said, there are more and more sophisticated tools available today, right? Especially using things like AI, etc., where you can take data that looks very different and create almost, we call these internally wizards, that can take a type of data and convert it into a certain standardized form of data, right? And you can create those wizards to be more custom for larger organizations and more standardized for smaller organizations. Apart from that, there is a certain set of tools that most companies use, right? You'll use SAP or use Oracle or you'll use different tools for different types of things, right? So over time, we are going to start integrating with those tools and directly pulling in the relevant data. So that will make it even more standardized.
And let me just add to that, actually, even from a data perspective, to answer your question, like we recently worked with a client that had, this was not even their entire data set, this was very specific to their what's called purchased goods and services, which is a specific type of category, had 4 million data points. And so the reason I would actually go as far as to say that it has to be productized, not only for scale, to Ankit's point about kind of, marginal cost and things like that, but even from just a pure kind of data throughput perspective, like you can't have an Excel spreadsheet with 4 million data points, right? It just doesn't exist. Like it's just not an efficient way to process that data. And the type of, when I walked you through a few of those models, the type of models doing those conversions are not Excel models. They're a lot more complex than Excel models. So to be clear, you can get kind of rough estimates using like a simple Excel model, and people do that, and there's true value to that as well. But if you are striving for the state of the science understanding, if you're striving for like a deep kind of insightful analysis of your operations, you have to productize it. There is just like from a technical perspective, it's very difficult for a consultant on an Excel spreadsheet to do it at that scale.